Hi, I'm Chris Overstreet, and I have opinions. Recently, Mike Johnson, who is Louisiana's greatest gift to dictatorship since Huey Long, made an interesting statement in one of his press conferences while he was telling the press that no, the House isn't coming back into session until Trump tells it to come back into session. And if that means that Trump is just going to make all the decisions and Congress isn't going to do anything, fine by Mike Johnson. But the really appalling thing that I noticed is this little quote right here. The last time I checked, Americans have more freedom right now to express themselves and speak their minds after Republicans took over. It is the Republicans who restored your right to share and speak your mind. Well, is that so? Let's begin with DEI, and before that, CRT, diversity, equality, inclusion, and critical race theory. Both of those terms got demonized by a guy named Christopher Rufo, who is currently serving as a high education official and head of a state college under Ron DeSantis down in Florida. And basically, he turned both of those into magic word arguments, basically saying, we're going to take these terms and put everything that we conservatives hate into them. And as a result, in multiple states right now, teachers are not allowed to teach that slavery is bad. They're not allowed to say that racism and sexism are bad. And why is this? Because conservatives don't want anybody to push back when they're telling their kids that racism and sexism are good. So yeah, there's one bit. Another bit that came up several years ago, of course, are drag queen story hours and the like. Of course, the right-wing pitched a fit and basically changed a bunch of state laws, so now in many states, it's illegal to appear in public in drag. A person in full clothing, but in a dress instead of men's clothing, would be considered on the par with a stripper in places like Tennessee and here in Texas. So yeah, free speech. Yeah, right. And, of course, conservative activists have been pushing the credit card merchant exchange people, and as a result, it is getting harder and harder for anyone who produces adult material to get paid. Because in today's economy, 3/4 of all transactions take place using plastic, either real or virtual. And if they're not going to let you use that plastic to buy your smut, then the people who make the smut, they don't get paid. At least not officially. Thanks to things like crypto, there's all sorts of ways you can money launder. And that's one of the few halfway legitimate applications for that fraudulent piece of crap. Oh yeah, I've got plenty of opinions about crypto, but they all boil down to it's funny money and you shouldn't touch it. Anyway, to get back to the point about free speech. More recently, let's look at this little image. Donald Trump, in an interview a couple of weeks back, is talking about his declaration by executive order against current Supreme Court precedent and against federal law. He's basically done away with the First Amendment and said, if you burn a flag, you get a year in jail. No trial, no courts. The Army just grabs you, year in jail. And his excuse was, we took the freedom of speech away because it's been through the courts, and the court said you have to have freedom of speech. But what happens is when they burn a flag, it agitates and irritates crowds. Well, yeah, protests are not meant to be applauded. You're protesting because you're not happy about something, and the people who are happy are not going to be happy about whatever you have to say. If it was popular, you wouldn't need to make a protest over it. But B, ICE right now is not just rounding up criminals, it's rounding up immigrants, even people who are here legally. On several occasions, we've got reports of actual United States citizens being rounded up and held for days. One person came out with a report that he was held solitary confinement, naked, for 3 days as a security risk because he was brown-skinned. Yeah, that sort of thing, that does annoy and irritate people. That does upset them. And Trump's got no problem with it there. So, yeah, that argument doesn't hold water. And then let's talk about the biggest example from the past 6 weeks. Everybody who said anything dirty about Charlie Kirk, and it got to the attention of the administration. Yeah, people losing their jobs as teachers, as public officials. That's kind of a gray area because the First Amendment only extends so far. It doesn't protect you from consequences of egregious talk. But it definitely does extend. This guy was in jail for 30 days on charges that, if he had been convicted, would have got him 6 years in prison. Because basically they were saying that his talk about Trump using Charlie Kirk as an excuse to institute a crackdown on protests, which was perfectly accurate, by the way. Yeah, they took that talk and said, this is a threat. It's a death threat against the president. Which it absolutely wasn't, and they knew it wasn't. They knew they couldn't prove it. But they were able to hold him in jail for over a month. And, of course, he lost his job. This is a cop, well, a former cop now. And, yeah, going to jail for saying bad shit about the president, that's the exact reason the First Amendment was made in the first place. That's what freedom of speech is for. But you can't tell Trump that. You can't tell Trump that. What I'm trying to say here is, in general, the Republican Party is working its hardest to protect free speech for Republicans and nobody else. Their definition of free speech is, we're free to speak, you're not. You're free to speak exactly what we tell you to speak. That's not anybody else's definition of freedom of speech. And if you actually support freedom of speech, if you support smut, if you support political protest, if you support just being a halfway nasty person on the internet, then you shouldn't support the Republican Party. Because they're not about free speech. They're about their speech. I'm Chris Overstreet, and I have opinions.